Life, a show about Jewish books, music, film, and web. I'm Heidi Estrin. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida. Additional support comes from the Association of Jewish Libraries. Marc Aronson is an editor, a publisher, and an author of historical nonfiction for young people. He writes the Nonfiction Matters column in School Library Journal and also hosts a blog by the same name. I met up with Marc at the 2008 School Library Journal Leadership Summit in Hollywood, Florida, to talk about his latest and perhaps most controversial book, Unsettled, The Problem of Loving Israel. We had such an interesting conversation that I hardly edited the recording at all. I hope you'll find meeting Marc as fascinating as I did. Please feel free to join our conversation by posting comments at bookoflifepodcast.com. Marc, you're the nonfiction columnist for School Library Journal, and you host a blog on their website called Nonfiction Matters. I think everyone acknowledges that nonfiction is important, but not everyone thinks nonfiction is enjoyable or that it counts as literature. How do you counteract that attitude?
It's funny, I'm giving a talk exactly about that at NCTE, to English teachers. And one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, what are the pleasures of reading? If the pleasures of reading are only identification with a character, pulse-pounding plot, or the interior reflection that comes from going through a story with a character that you identify with and that you're deepened by seeing his or her struggles, then maybe you'll find much of nonfiction less pleasurable. However, if the pleasures of reading include learning things, gaining information, moral depth, learning how to effect action in the world, change the world. If we think, for example, just now of the presidential election, of Obama's election, how many young people were excited about political change, action in the world, which they can only learn about through nonfiction, through how other people at other times have made real change in the actual world. I was just talking yesterday, actually, about a survey that we want to do in YALSA about asking young people about the pleasures of nonfiction. And we started to list some of what are those pleasures. For example, hobbies, pets, lifestyle. All of these are pleasures. If you really are so thrilled you're about to get a dog, learning how to take care of that well is pleasurable. Just like for an adult who buys a cookbook not just because he or she wants to prepare a dish, but also you savor. It's the kind of anticipatory savoring of reading about the ingredients and what you're going to do. That's the same for a younger reader who's reading about how they are now going to be able to do something that they hadn't done before. So all of these are pleasures. But I think for me, I am by training a historian, there's really one other pleasure that reading is my primary reason for reading a book, and that's the pleasure of thinking. And I think part of the problem is that in a school focus, we often associate thinking with assignments. You're forced to do this thing because you want to get a good grade or you're going to be tested or your parents want you to go to a good school or something like that. So thinking is a duty, it's a chore. But thinking is, in fact, a pleasure. You're using your mind. You're coming up with new ideas. You're having fresh insights. You're seeing the world in a new way. Well, to me, books that bring that pleasure are a gift, and I treasure the opportunity to have them, to read them.
Very eloquent.
Thank you.
Is nonfiction for youth now different than it was during our childhoods?
Yeah, very, very much so. I think I'm actually going to be talking about this at this conference here. A librarian whom I really like, a school librarian, did a little PowerPoint saying, our book's obsolete. And her point is the single volume reference, which used to be, every kid came racing into the library because they needed to get to the encyclopedia to get that little pithy thing so that they could write their short essay. Well, that is in many ways dying out. Now kid who has a computer can get that information and much more. There's not this competition for the one expensive resource that the library has. What's good about that for those of us who write nonfiction is it means we're freed from that. The book that gives dispassionate, very well researched, specific, pithy information, probably in most cases better done on the internet. The book that has an individual take, that it has an individual orientation, a freshness of insight, a freshness of writing, that is as personal in its investigation and its style as a novel. To me, it's the glory day of that kind of book, because that's what it is much harder to find on the internet. Websites are not, very rarely does someone spend a year crafting the language of a website. They may spend a lot of attention on design and interesting interactive features. I don't mean to demean the effort in a website, but it's not really spent on, have I written this sentence in the most beautiful, in the most compelling, in the most moving fashion? Well, that's what we have to do. And so to me, it's the opportunity for a golden age, because we're freed from, we're prevented from. We can't do that old kind of book because someone else is doing it better and cheaper and in a way that's more broadly available. I would say there's something else too, and that relates to what I was just saying. I think that a lot of the concern about nonfiction, especially in a school library, but in any library context for K-12, has been traditionally about accuracy. In other words, is it accurate? Is it thorough? And absolutely, I think we must always aim for the highest standards in that. I have a doctorate in history. I try to bring exactly the same level of thoroughness in research to writing for teenagers or middle grade as I would in an academic writing. But I think that we have to recognize that what can characterize our books now is passion. That kids will respond to a book that, hey, I've never seen a book like this before. I've never seen a book like this that was so personal, that was so passionate. And I think the key word I would like school librarians to start thinking about, shifting from accuracy, is falsifiability. In other words, if I, as the author, begin the book with a certain passion, have I therefore avoided counter-evidence? Or have I dealt with counter-evidence? The question is not, what's my point of view? But have I let the evidence challenge my point of view? And that's what we can show kids. Not that you should remove yourself in nonfiction, that you should have no feelings about your subject. Why? There's nothing else in life where we're encouraging you to have no feeling. It's that you have the feeling, but you respect what you learn. And if what you learn contradicts where you want your emotions to go or how you thought it was going to be, you have to go with that. A few books ago, I wrote a book called Witch Hunt: Mysteries of the Salem Witch Trials. And I, in graduate school, had studied Salem. So when I decided to write that book, I felt pretty much that I knew, not that I could give a pretty rich explanation of what happened at Salem in terms of the fact that people at the time very significantly did believe in witches. So what I wanted to do was shift from the sort of Arthur Miller Crucible point of view, where it's sort of sexually repressed people who cannot accept themselves and therefore lash out at this fantasy. And I was going to show that actually people did believe in witches, which in many cases was true. But when I was researching the book, I ran into a scholar who made an extremely compelling case that the testimony of the people who accused witch was a conscious lie. That it was not a product of belief, that it was a product of calculation. Now, I could not ultimately prove that he was right, nor does he have a convincing explanation for why they did it. But I had to stop in what I thought I was going to write because I encountered an analysis that I could not ignore. And to me, that's a good lesson for kids. You think you know why such and such happened. you read a source that makes you think, gosh, I didn't get it, you have to take account of that. And that, again, I think is a bit different from where nonfiction in the past used to have this sort of, Moses coming down from Sinai, like, here is the truth,
right,
and you are to absorb it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think much more what is coming in to our books is process. What do we know? What don't we know? What's the limit of our knowledge? And what's great about that to me is it also tells young people there's stuff for you to learn. We don't have all the answers. I just saw a NOVA program this week about, they're investigating the story, you may have heard of this creature they're calling the Hobbit, this 3-foot tall skeleton they had found in this Indonesian island, and there's been all this dispute. Was it actually some other humanoids, or was just this a person who had a disease and so was malformed? But the most exciting theory to come out of it is that there may have been an earlier or simultaneous migration out of Africa of Australopithecus, that is to say Lucy, and that there may in fact have been these 3-foot tall humanoids living somewhere on the edges of where we, Homo sapiens, lived. And so the possibility may be that we have to completely rethink our whole evolutionary structure. How exciting for a kid. It's not that everybody knows everything and you don't, but knowledge is changing, and you may be part of it.
So all of what you just said ties in really well with the book that I want to talk to you about, which is your new book, Unsettled.
Right.
So I've got a lot of specific questions about it, but let me just start by asking you to very briefly tell us about Unsettled.
Sure. There's really 3 sources for this book. One is, it is Israel's 60th anniversary, and I thought it would be a good time to write about Israel. I have a very personal connection to Israel because my grandfather moved there from Kiev in the 1920s, taking 6 of his 10 children. So between those uncles and aunts and their children, and some of that's on my father's side, and on my mother's side, several of her family that either got there just before the war or after, having been in Theresienstadt, got there. And then even in my wife's family, she's half Jewish, part of her family is there, so I'm always in Israel. I'm constantly going there, reading about it. It's been a very big part of my life. And then finally, as I was saying, I am a historian. And so I thought, yes, I'm trained as an Americanist. No, I don't read Hebrew. I don't read Arabic. But I thought, let me apply to Israel, to all of everything I've thought and felt in Israel, everything I've read about Israel on the occasion of its anniversary, to kind of wrestle with what is Israel? How did it come to be? What is it today? What are its challenges? And I think, really crucially, what is it from my vantage? Again, I'm not God. I'm one individual, one American Jew with a deep connection to Israel. How does it look to me? How does it unsettle me? What questions does it provoke for me? And I hope that in doing that, and in doing that especially for teenagers, I would give them a way to wrestle. Because my feeling is, and perhaps this is a question you'll ask, that the way we talk about Israel in America is so binary. It's either yay Israel or boo Israel. Mm-hmm. It's either Israel is great, whatever it does, stand by Israel, or Israel is an apartheid state, Zionism is racism, it absolutely deserves condemnation. And I feel that we don't view any other country, certainly not America, that way. And I don't think it's healthy, perhaps even especially for Jewish kids, to be in that kind of bifurcated world where if a criticism of Israel comes up, they either have to dismiss it, knock it out of the ballpark, or have some kind of corrosive self-doubt as if they have lived in a world that's denied reality, which then leads to a kind of conversion experience to the other side. And it seemed to me, why don't I bring out all the questions that trouble me, the questions that have been discussed, wrestle with them, and therefore invite young people, perhaps to completely disagree with me, but to then publicly air all of the questions around Israel. And so that's what I've tried to do in this book.
Okay. The full title is Unsettled, The Problem of Loving Israel, which is a really provocative title.
Right.
So what makes loving Israel a problem?
The problem of loving Israel is that I have a deep attachment to the place, and yet find aspects of Israel's history and its current situation deeply troubling. And I think most basically it's this, and this is what I came to realize even in writing the book. I'm a product of a belief in integration. Integration, it has formed all of my life in America, where obviously it very much had to do with black-white integration, and certainly this election shows something that's crucially important with this country. Israel is not built on that principle. As I discovered in writing the book, I didn't know this before I went there the last time, 14% of Americans are African American, 15% of Americans are Hispanic, 20% of Israelis are Arabs, some Muslim, some Christian. A higher percentage of the citizens of Israel, leaving aside, I'm not talking about West Bank, right of return, refugee, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about paying your taxes within Israel, voting in Israeli elections, are Arabs. Well, think about this one fact, and I'm sure certainly for me and for anybody who's listening to this, we were formed by the Brown versus Board of Ed. The crucial phrase of the Supreme Court, separate is not equal. That was not just economically black schools are better off, but that separating people is unhealthy, leads to attitudes and beliefs on both sides that are corrosive, that are destructive. In Israel, there are 3 K-12 schools that are integrated, Jewish and Arab. Every other school is not, even though 20% of the citizens of Israel. Now, to be fair, that is not simply on the Jewish side. Arabs primarily live in their own villages in which there are no Jews. So even, if you simply make a school by who lives near it, it's going to be Jews or it's going to be Arabs. But back to why I say, is it a problem? It's a society that's built on a principle that's completely different from the principle that has formed me and that I feel comfortable with. And so, as I say in the first line of my book, I love Israel. And as I say on the last line of that same first page, but I could not live there. And so the problem is to be deeply attached to a place, to admire it profoundly, and yet to find it in some very fundamental way alien. Mm-hmm. And that is part of what I wrestle with in this book.
What sort of startled me as I read this book, and you were kind of talking about this before, is you made the unusual decision, I think maybe it's not as unusual anymore, to share your point of view rather than to try to be neutral, as in traditional, quote-unquote, nonfiction. But this is a topic it's almost impossible to be neutral, so you're probably smart not to try. So I guess I wanted to find out a little bit more. You talked about that earlier, but how you decided to take this very personal approach.
I actually felt there was nothing else I could do. I felt that to write in a kind of distant, objective tone, the State of Israel was born, was it May 14th, 1948, as if I was a voiceover on some kind of, it would be such a lie. And I was partially formed by an experience. My last book was called Race, A History Beyond Black and White, and it's a history of race, not just in America, but throughout the world and throughout history and prejudice. And I began that book by describing an incident at my local swimming pool where a young black man was accused of stealing something, and I was sure he did, even though I didn't see the theft. In fact, I didn't even know which of a group of the young black men in front of me was accused. And in that same book, when I get to the Holocaust, I have a 2-page section in which I say that I emotionally do not forgive the Germans. That's not my judgment. That's not my conclusion. That's not my behavior, but it is my feelings. And I can tell you that having spoken to many, many schools and many, many kids, it is those two passages that kids respond to most strongly. Most often by disagreeing with what I say about the Germans. To them, Germans are kids their age. You say, how can you blame someone their age for something their grandparents did? They feel that I'm wrong. But then something happens after we have that discussion. They will often say, I have prejudices. I've never really been able to talk about it. I've always felt so badly that I have these feelings. You make it possible not to act on a prejudice, not to justify a prejudice, but to talk about it. And so I felt that having sort of marked that territory where I bring myself forward in race as in Israel, trying my best to be objective in my description of history, but also to show myself. And I will say, I think it was that Holocaust section, which probably, I've edited 5 books on the Holocaust, often diaries kept by kids. And the fact is, I'm an editor, I'm trying to create a great book for young people to read, but my feelings are affected. And I don't think that's wrong. And I don't think it's wrong to show that. And so in the same case of Israel, I'm going to be I said, when I finished my book, I sent it to a bunch of really important scholars of Israel, some Jewish, some not Jewish, to get their views. I want it to be as solid a history as there is. But I'm me. My name is on that book. It's not written by the Committee of Historical Inquiry on Israeli-Palestinian Relations. Uh-huh. It's written by Marc Aronson. Mm-hmm. And I'm a human. And I do have feelings about this. And again, I think that's good. Now, does that mean kids are going to come back to me and say, well, my feeling is you're wrong? Okay. So now you have, back to your very first question, now I have an engaged reader. Mm-hmm. Now I have a reader who wants to make a contention back to me, who wants to prove that something I've said. And I say in the book, if my readers, and I hope they can read Hebrew or Arabic or just are more diligent than me and prove that I'm wrong, what a wonderful thing. If we've gotten kids who march out and do their own research and prove that I've gotten something fundamentally incorrect, I've done my job. And so that yeah, so that's what I mean.
In Unsettled, you draw many parallels
right.
between American history and Israeli history.
Right.
What do you think the two countries can teach each other?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually think I only realized this after I wrote the book. I think America and Israel are the countries that most remind me of each other. And I think it's because we're both founded on ideals. We're not countries founded just because some king happened to be here, some royal family conquered it 700 years ago. We're founded on principles, but we're also founded on force, and we're founded on whatever biases and prejudices come with the ability of the majority to impose its will on the minority. We are both. And I think in America, especially since the 60s, we've wrestled with that. We've wrestled with the mixture between our ideals. We deeply admire Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. We know that Jefferson very likely had a slave mistress with whom he had children that he never acknowledged. We in America have gotten used to the idea that it doesn't defame Jefferson to draw a bigger picture of him. In fact, it's wrestling with him. In Israel, there are those who do that. I think the case that I bring up is the Israeli historian Benny Morris, who has done the most to research the massacres and rape, a few cases of rapes of Israelis perpetrated on Palestinians in 1948. He is controversial, no doubt, but that wrestling with Israel's history and that acknowledgement is not to denigrate Israel. It is to engage with it in the same way as that we in America have. The thing I've been thinking about recently, because I have had both great praise for Unsettled and absolute condemnation, is that in the 60s, if any of you will recall, when Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement began in the South, the argument against Martin Luther King was that he was un-American, that he was communist, that he was weakening America, that it was unpatriotic, that it was somehow unsettling a settled circumstance, and that would weaken the country. Well, we all know now that's not right. It strengthened the country. Well, I feel that we in America have not gone through that same process about Israel. We treat any questioning about Israel as if it's unpatriotic, as if it's undermining, as if it's giving aid and comfort to Israel's enemies, as if it weakens the country. That's the broadest parallel. There are many. For example, the parallel that occurred to me when I was writing about the '67 war is that the Six-Day War, is it most reminds me of the Mexican War in America, where the occasion of the Mexican War sparked this discussion of manifest destiny. America is destined, or white America, Protestant America, is destined to rule the continent of North America, much as people spoke of Judea and Samaria and the greater Israel and biblical prophecy. But the other side of the Mexican War is that Abraham Lincoln and Henry David Thoreau and people like that spoke of this as this moral abomination, and because it would lead to the spread of slavery. And in fact, the Mexican War is very often pointed to as a direct cause of the Civil War, because as you expanded America and the question of the expansion of slavery, the country could not hold together. And I think similarly, in Israel, the taking over of the West Bank and the expansion of the settlements both fed a kind of an expansionist, hey, this is all ours, this all belongs to us, it's the land God promised, and a kind of moral revulsion among Israelis at that attitude. And I don't know that it will lead to a civil war in Israel, but I do think there's an interesting parallel in that case. I hasten to add that in saying that I think the holding on to the territories and the settlements are wrong, I think Israel had to fight in '67. I think it's perfectly understandable that it took the land that was available to it at that moment. It's even perfectly emotionally understandable that the Israelis felt like, wow, we can do this. This is ours. As I say in the book, if the Palestinians had taken Tel Aviv, they would have felt the same way and certainly would not have negotiated to go back. So I don't say this out of some kind of condemnatory stance, but rather to say that practically, realistically, and morally, I believe the Israelis do have to move out off the West Bank, off the occupied territories, within whatever security lines are agreed upon, providing for the future, but I think that's a step Israel needs to take. Yeah.
One of the parallels that you talked about in the book, or I guess it's sort of like a time shift parallel, you feel like America has been through something that maybe Israel is going through now, and,
right.
and that they could learn from our experience?
Well, let me give a perfect example. When during our presidential election, there were some Israelis who were rooting for McCain, who they thought would be more sort of hawkish and more ready to bomb Iran if needed or whatever. But some of my relatives, the more left Israelis, were praying, staying up all night for Obama. Not because they thought he would do anything different, but because it represented the possibility of change. And this week, there's an editorial in Haaretz, which the Israeli newspaper, which says, we need to involve the Arabs more, and it brings the hypothetical, could we imagine having a Muslim or an Arab citizen of Israel being prime minister? And I think our wrestling with what is it to be integrated? What is it to be going to school with someone who's of a completely different faith and background? What is it to elect as your president a representative of a minority who some in the majority feel will therefore wreak retribution on them? We're not perfect, we're imperfect. But we're going through this. And we at least can offer to our Israeli cousins and relatives and friends what our experience is. We can't tell them what to do, but we can describe what we've gone through. And so I think that's why Haaretz and others look to Obama as the possibility of change, that you can take a step away from the majority having to hold on to its control in the same fashion.
On your blog, you mentioned that a reader told you were being too nice to Muslims in your book.
Right.
And you were actually doing a blog post about, I guess, the American attitude.
I didn't know this, but I guess there is, post 9/11, when people started to talk about clash of civilizations, etc., and some important scholarly work was done about radical Islam, and maybe we weren't aware of how widespread some of these attitudes were, and even how some of them had roots in fascist movements. We had all known that some of the leaders of Palestinians had worked with the Nazis, but a broader argument started to be made that Islam itself was not an Abrahamic religion, not, similar to the, quote, Judeo-Christian ethic, but was somehow fundamentally different. And this has been framed, interestingly, in terms of things like human rights, the idea that women are oppressed, and the idea that as if Islam in its nature needs to have jihad, needs to have war, and they'll quote certain lines from the Quran, and needs to encase women in hijabs, etc. And none of this is true. Islam is as varied as any religion. A Nigerian Muslim is not an Indonesian Muslim, is not a Bangladeshi Muslim, is not a Muslim who lives in Dearborn or in Brazil. Similarly, if one wanted to quote from Luther about his, despicable attitudes towards the Jews, you could argue that Lutherans are fundamentally different and intolerant. So my feeling is that we must acknowledge damaging strains in Islam as we acknowledge damaging strains in Judaism or Christianity or secularism or communism. But to characterize Islam as if it were an entity, invariant, that imposes destructive qualities on people is just ridiculous. And yet, I have had emails to me, I've learned of school systems which are, under the heading of teaching about world religions, are trying to pass along this attitude, and I think it's very wrong. I will say I am fundamentally a Freudian. I think people are flawed, people have destructive impulses, and the society they're in gives a way to channel them. If you're told Jews are bad, maybe you'll funnel your destructive impulse that way. If you're told blacks are bad, you'll do it that way. If you're told Palestinians are bad, you'll do it that way. I think the problem is that we have human weakness, not that Islam is a destructive religion. I think if you're in an Islamic culture and available to you is a kind of jihadist fundamentalism, some people will take it. So that's my view on that.
Okay. You mentioned that you've gotten the positive and negative reactions from readers. Have the reactions of the target audience of teen readers been different from the reactions of adult readers?
Well, I'll say this. The adult readers have been very binary, as I said, from the highest praise to the most condemning. And the phrase the adult people keep using is self-hating, which I really wonder, why is to question self-hating? I thought the question was to be Jewish. I have spoken to various groups of teenagers, and they've responded exactly as I hoped, in that it opens up dialogue and opens up discussion. What I'm going to tell you now is going to sound made up, like a politician's line, but it's so true. I went to speak at a Quaker school that's 40% Jewish. The kids aren't Quaker. It's run by Quakers. I spoke to the whole high school about all this. Afterwards, 4 10th graders came up to me. An African-American girl who literally did not know where Israel was on a map or what the whole issue was about. A sort of quiet Hispanic girl who didn't have any strong views about it. One of the 2 Muslim kids in the school whose father is an activist. for Palestinian rights, and a Jewish girl who's literally counting the days till she can go to birthright. So, and here they were all talking and, having a forum to, the issue to me was not, do you agree with me? I'm not selling products here. I mean, yes, I'd like you to buy my book, but this gave them a way to now air and discuss and compare views, and that was an ideal opportunity for me. Then one of the smartest kids in the school, who I had met the year before, I talked to quietly afterwards, and he very strongly disagreed with me. His argument basically was that Israel's the threats to Israel are such that is defining, and to talk about civil rights issues within Israel is you sort of can't do it because you have to primarily deal with the threat. It's something that adults bring up, and a very valid position. I don't agree with it, but it's a reasonable position. I think on the adult side, the condemnation has tended to come from people who almost feel like what I'm saying shouldn't be said, as if what I am saying is somehow is not allowable in the discourse on Israel, that it is to be completely marginalized. And I think among kids they're more, and this is something else, and you would know this, and I hope others who listen to this, adults have this fear that kids are impressionable. So people are saying, you're giving them opinions on Israel, are you going to mold them, whatever? I actually think kids are smart. And I also am not coming to kids with a final conclusion. I have attitudes, but I'm giving them information and showing my position. And I'm stimulating them to think. And I think adults who fear that kids are going to be sort of just passively molded by this and turn into Israel haters or turn into some kind of misguided people with half information. Well, that's not the goal of my book, and certainly not been my experience with kids. So that's what it's been so far, but, we'll see.
That's interesting. I was looking at Amazon.
Yes.
Actually, let me go back to the reaction question and say, have Israeli reactions been different from the reactions of American readers?
So far, the only Israelis who've read it are my relatives, who both politically and personally have been quite positive. Although I have relatives who haven't read it yet, who are politically may not be as supportive. The photo research in the book was done by one of my Israeli cousins, who's definitely more to the right of me politically.
There was an interview you did on Blog Pulse where you talked about how it feels odd to switch between being a member of the family and an author writing about that family.
Right.
So how's that going to work now that your relatives are going to read the book?
My wife was just saying to me last night about how she can we figure out a way to go to Israel next summer or whatever, and then I was thinking, how are they going to feel about me? And nothing that I say in this book is at all outside of the spectrum of common discussion in Israel. They may not agree with me, but they're not going to be outraged because they're having the same disputes with their neighbors and online and in the political forum. So that's what I anticipate. I hope, but you don't know. It's like someone who writes their first novel about, semi-autobiographical first novel and then has to go to Thanksgiving,
That's right. I was looking at Amazon and I saw that you got a couple of reviews. You got 2 negative reviews, but now they allow a response to the review. So then you got one of the negative reviews had somebody else comment on that review and defend.
I hadn't seen the comment.
Which is very interesting. So it's not just individual reviews, but an actual conversation is starting.
I hope so.
And I wondered if maybe you were going to log into Amazon and join that conversation.
Well, I didn't know you could do that. Now I will. The thing that's bugged me about those 2 Amazon comments, and I understand there's a review coming in the Jewish Library Journal, whatever it is, that's going to say the same thing, is that it sort of condemns my scholarship. And my feeling is I haven't read the review yet. Maybe they've found some date that I got wrong or something, although I certainly tried hard not to. As I said, I am a historian. I did send my manuscript to be vetted by very, very serious scholars. So there's nothing in there that is just, hey, I happened to think of it one morning, or I went to the PLA Authority website and drank the Kool-Aid. It's just, no, it's not like that. So I don't mind someone disagreeing with me or pointing out an error, but a kind of blanket, this is all completely unscholarly, well, that's just not true. And on, for example, the issue of Deir Yassin, this massacre that Benny Morris and others have written about, there are debates exactly as to precisely what happened, how many were killed. There is no doubt that the Palestinian leadership exaggerated, as I say in the book, the number of people killed or made up mutilations that the Jews were supposed to have done. That's true. But back to what I said at the beginning, to be writing about the 48 war and to deal with the fact that Jews were involved in massacres is troubling. It's just troubling. And it doesn't mean it's not understandable. It doesn't mean that in the fog of war, under intense pressure, when in fact the Palestinians themselves had been involved with atrocities, it's not understandable. It is understandable. But that doesn't mean we should ignore it. That doesn't mean it isn't troubling. Just as we in America have wrestled with putting the Japanese in the internment camps, we can say that looking back, especially after 9/11, that we can understand in wartime an atmosphere of fear. Yes, but we can also say it was wrong. And that doesn't make us any less American or patriotic. So again, it bothers me to be condemned as if I had been flaky in some way, but to disagree, sure, that's fine.
One more question.
Sure.
Since they haven't called yet.
Yes.
I heard you say in another interview that this book is kind of a love letter to Israel. So,
right.
And some people might think it's hate mail. So tell why it's a love letter.
To me, a lover is someone who's so close to a subject that they care to say what they think, that they care to engage. I mean, to me, to love a person or a place or anything is not to say, you're great, buddy, you're great, I love you. That's maybe it's a sort of kind of maternal love. But another kind of love is to care enough that it matters to you, that you have to think out loud, that you have to show what you feel. I think, again, part of what's bothered me so much about Israel has been the way it's been the province of the spokesman. And I often feel like neither of them are me. The spokesman who says great, great Israel or bad, bad Israel, neither of them resembles my engagement with Israel. And so it's a love letter as anyone would write about a place they deeply care about. And maybe, I hope it doesn't sound egotistical, but to analogy is I loved Obama's race speech after the Reverend Wright controversy, because that was a kind of love letter to what America aspires to be and what it has not overcome, how it has not fully lived up to that image of the perfect union, and the bitterness that has been left on both sides in that aspiration that's incomplete. That, to me, was a loving statement about America. And in a way, that's what I mean this to be. It's a love letter in that same way. It's not quite tough love, but it's I care enough to tell you. I can't disengage. I can't walk away. I can't leave you to your own devices or your critics to their bile. I care enough that I have to put myself forward and give my position in this struggle. And so that's what I tried to do in the book. And I think there's just passion in the book. It matters to me to figure out what Israel is and what it is to me. It's important. I couldn't ignore it.
All right, good.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for meeting with me.
I was glad. It was great questions. And now I'll have to listen to the podcast.
You can see a short video of Marc Aronson on a school visit discussing several of his books on our website, bookoflifepodcast.com. Thanks to blogger Amy Boland for sharing the video. The Book of Life is a podcast service of Congregation B'nai Israel of Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries online at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band at freilachmakers.com. Visit our podcast website at bookoflifepodcast.com or listen to the latest episode by phone at 916-313-3820. We welcome your comments and questions at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and happy reading.